Hello and welcome back to Fullerton College Pre-Press class. I'm Professor Ben Kiewit. Hello. And I'm going to start out this particular video by a little bit more show and tell because we're going to talk about the trimming off of edges of paper and then binding methods. I wanted to show you an interesting piece of historical leftover, a historical find I had. Anyways, we didn't always trim off the outside edges of books when we sold them. For a long time, even into the 20th century, when you bought a new book, the pages were uncut, and you, the reader, there we go. There's my camera. You, the reader, would tear the edges as you read through the book. So the idea of a bookmark or dog-earing pages so you know where you were in the book didn't matter so much. The first time you read it, the pages you've already read were torn. You just cut the top edge yourself with like a letter opener and the edges of some of them as well. Let me show you. Here's one I dug up. It's a French book from 1948 about actually it's a memoir of a pilot who fought for the British in World War II. After France fell, he escaped occupied France and continued to fly fighter planes against the Nazis. Go Pierre, you're a hero. Anyways, the book, you can see the edges look a little bit extra ragged here because they're actually not even cut yet. I found an edition that hadn't been trimmed. So like we were talking about our folding signatures, you can see here, as you do this carefully so I don't damage it, I'll let my dad tear it open. This is for my dad eventually because he's learning to speak French and also likes aviation history. But anyways, up in here, you can see that the top of the page is not trimmed. And even, sorry, the camera's a little wonky on this computer webcam. So pardon my very lo-fi way of doing this. If we were in campus, I'd let you guys handle this thing. Down at the bottom too, you see some of the bottoms are not trimmed. And we find an example therein. The second half of that signature, there are, and you have to see it from the bottom, there are face edges that are not trimmed. This is whoops, don't worry, that's only the dust jacket. This book is untrimmed. So older books, if you find them in used bookstores and places, untrimmed means it's never actually been read. It's still new. It's like the little pop seal on the top of your jelly jars has not been popped. This is an unused book from 1948. Merry belated Christmas, Dad. And so now we're back. Actually, we don't need my face anymore. Goodbye. So book trimming is actually a relatively recent thing we started doing. People now prefer their books pre-trimmed so they don't have to tear their pages or cut them. It's charming, it's old-fashioned, and remember, if you ever find one that's that way, it's a little bit more rare, not only for being old, but for being not yet read. I'm going to go and rewrap that. I had to unwrap the gift to show it to you. Anyways, so nowadays you take them over to a guillotine cutter, like the one we have in our print lab. Some of you have seen it, some of you have not in person. I'll have to make a video to show you what that looks like. And the guillotine, much to its namesake, is a giant blade that comes down and cuts a straight line. But instead of removing noblemen's heads, we just take the edges off of papers. We use it to trim off the edges. You pick up as many of the booklets or signatures. Sometimes you trim individual signatures as you can. You put them in. You put the stitch side against the sidewall and you cut off the bottom of the top. You jog them in. Jogging means you're tapping the edges to stack them. And where'd my mouse go? There we are. And you trim it off. The huge knife comes down. It just cuts the margin of the page of the press sheet off and off the bottom, the foot of the page, and it's gone. And you can go ahead and recycle that. When that's done, you flip it over and you put that freshly trimmed foot against the backstop and you cut the top edge off. You still have the binding edge pressed against the sidewall of the cutter at this point. And it cuts off the other side. Chop, chop. And the last one you do is you put the binding edge against the backstop of the cutter and you cut the face off. That sounds really bad. And that sounds actually rather reminiscent of the original purpose of guillotines. But you cut the thumb edge, as it's also called, the edge that people read and open up the book. That has to be trimmed. As I showed you in Le Grand Cirque, you have pages that cannot be opened until that's been trimmed. And in all of this, you get a nice, clean trim. People love to see their books these days with nice, clean edges. I do too. It's very pleasing to see those nice, clean, trimmed edges, isn't it? So saddle stitching, that's when we do that stapling thing. We were talking about that in the last video. So stapling, again, is the derogatory term and only really applies if you use a stapler, not a saddle stitcher. But in the end, even if you use a saddle stitcher, though it starts with a spool of wire, technically ends with staples. Let me share with you another thing real quick here. Oops, wrong window. Hello again. So I'll share with you a book that I got my daughter, which she's not quite all the way able to read yet at 4, but we use it for our camping and hiking trips. Here's a little pocket guide to different kinds of trees you find here on the west coast of the US. Ooh, now you can identify them by the pine cones. We're all naturey. But anyways, this is, let me see if you can see it on the screen here. Yes, you can see it. You can see the staples. This booklet has been saddle stitched. For small books and pocket guides, not just things like magazines, but smaller books like this, it's worth saddle stitching. It's a valid, real way of doing things. It doesn't mean it's any cheaper or cheaper quality or anything. It's the correct thing for short books. But you can see already this one's pushing the limits of how thick can I saddle stitch. See how it doesn't quite lay flat? And you see exactly how much of that uh, what do you call it? The spine gets really thick with all that stapling. Oh, I said stapling. I meant saddle stitching. So one of the biggest limits on saddle stitching is how many sheets you can actually do. Um, there's also the related video I gave you from the Guinness Book of World Records, most folds on a sheet of paper. She actually talks about it mathematically, about how much paper ends up getting spent going around that spine. It doesn't just not lay flat, but it also does something called creep. One of those great words you can use. We've already had stripper for how to do layout if you're not using a computer. Now we have creep. There's some great more stuff. People will also call it sometimes push out or shingling. And what happens is the more sheets of paper you wrap around the middle, the more distance the paper has to travel to get around the spine, which means the front of the page and the back of the book, those parts of the pages start to get shorter and shorter on the outside. And it looks like the middle is longer. So when you can see in this diagram here, when you trim off the face and you have too many sheets in there, sure, you're trimming right at the nice crop mark right on the front cover and the back cover of this little signature. But when you get to the middle spread of that thing, you're chopping like a quarter to a half an inch of otherwise usable space off. And that causes other problems. You need to be aware physically of what's happening in these final projects, or sorry, in these final stages of a project. Like I said, you have to know the end from the beginning. When you plan for a project, you're planning to create a book and it's going to be saddle stitched. You need to know that and account for it before you do your layout, because otherwise, things that you meant to have on your page are going to get cut off. Sentences may be running along and along on the page, and suddenly they see what I did there. But you start cutting off words, cutting off images. Images, you're expecting to have a white border at the edge of your page, but when you trim too close, instead you have a picture that goes full bleed, and it was never meant to be full bleed. Creep can be excessive. The thicker the paper and the more sheets you use, the more pronounced the creep is. That's something you want to be careful about too. There's no hard and fast rule because you're dealing with the thickness of the paper, how well that paper folds, and how many sheets are going on there. There's a lot of factors that lead to creep and what makes it as big as it can be. Just like in life, in printing, you don't want a big creep. Ha ha ha, I am funny. I'm not really funny. Next, we'll talk about perfect binding. And perfect binding is the best way to think about it is paperback books. Again, those New York Times bestsellers you can get at the checkouts of grocery stores, or also the vast majority of books sold are, in fact, um, what do you call it? Now I just lost my word again. Ha ha. They're perfect bound. Perfect binding, you trim them slightly and then you glue them on the spine. Here's a perfect binding book. Oh, that poor book. It was for science. Thank you for your sacrifice. But this book here has part of the cover ripped off, so you can see the glue that wraps around the edges of all the signatures here. And that is how the pages are held together. Sometimes they call it adhesive binding. Perfect's what I'm used to hearing it as. So perfect binding. Oftentimes on the edge that's being glued in, though, you have to trim off a little or grind it down or scratch at it or sand at it to make the paper more absorbent, especially if you're using glossy paper, because glossy paper doesn't absorb glue the way that uncoated paper can absorb it. So you have to rough it up to allow the glue to go in and bind. Signatures can be stacked to do this. Oftentimes they're stacked together like this, one on top of the other. They're never nested. The way I showed you earlier, where you put one inside another, you don't do that for perfect binding because then you're not able to glue them. So anyways, they're stacked like this. So the binding edge then creates a gutter, a space you can't use. If you're doing perfect binding, You also know, just from being a reader of these books, you can't open them all the way flat. You can't see the edge of the inside edge of the page on the gutter. As you open it up, it will always bend into where it's been glued and never lay all the way flat without cracking and breaking the spine. So that's called the binding gutter. In saddle stitching, that's fine. You can open it up all the way and see that part where the papers touch, but not in perfect binding. In perfect binding, they're gripped tightly by that glue and you're not going to get in there. So there's extra space, again, depending on paper type and quantities and things, about exactly how much of that is unusable. But understand that you're going to have unusable space between pages when you're using perfect binding. The gutter is double the grind off because you cut some, they call it grind off, but it's really trimmed. You cut off about 1/8 of an inch. You're looking at losing 1/4 of an inch of the inside of your spreads to bindery. Case binding is how you make hardbound books, and this is the oldest, most traditional method of binding books to make big books. Volumes like library editions and things use this. Hardcover. They're actually stitched together, like literally with thread. They are sewn together on the inside. That's one of the things that makes them so durable and also so flexible. You can open the book all the way. It's a hardcover. It has a thick board and a thick board wrapped in a cloth. And on the spine, the pages are actually sewn to a small backing back there that's going to help them open up and be flexible and durable. Case binding is great because it lets you use and reuse a book without damaging it so much, and they are much more survivable for long-term use. Things like libraries and textbooks really like to use this sort of thing. And yeah, I'm even more shameless on my book selection here. I think I need help. And so we're back. So, whoops, case binding, yes. There's no paper ground off on the edge, so you can actually use the whole thing. There's no issue of losing that inside, and you can open them pretty wide open and be able to lay them mostly flat. Now let's talk mechanical binding. Yet again, I'm going to jump over and show you in person. And mechanical binding is anything that uses a physical object to hold your thing together. Most commonly are things like comb and spiral binding. Here's a spiral bound book. This is one that I made for myself at school at one point. It's for a game I play. But anyways, the spiral binding holds individual sheets in and you can open it up. One of the advantages of spiral binding is you can lay the book flat and you can flip it over and see a reference page if you need a reference page for things like game manuals and repair manuals. For things like games, I actually prefer spiral binding because you can lay it flat. So when you find that reference page you need for something you're trying to do in a game, or if it's a repair manual or something, or even a cookbook, I prefer them like this because every other type of book will try to close itself, but not spiral binding. Good stuff, so long as you use it in the right place. So mechanical binding is catch-all for anything you use mechanical devices. Technically, even a 3-ring binder is mechanical binding. It's a mechanical and it binds paper together. That makes it mechanical binding. You basically trim the pages to size before you bind when you're doing mechanical binding. And as you can see in the picture, and as you saw in the book I held up, mechanical binding also has a tax. If you're typically speaking, if you're going to be using a mechanical binding, you have to punch holes in the edge of the page, either for spiral or a binder or other things, or even if you're clamping, you're going to lose more of that binding edge gutter because you have to allow for where those things go. So understand yet again, that edge of the page is not yours for use. I hope this has been useful. Sorry again for the awkward pause where I didn't realize I was still recording. At least I kept myself together and didn't like pick my nose on the video or anything. That'd be really embarrassing. I'll see you guys again soon. Thanks for watching.